2018, FATA was not integrated into the rest of Pakistan. Even today, it remains largely unintegrated. So violence against the state through military operations, through drone strikes, which actually exacerbated conflict. So we actually show in our paper the rise of violence really coincides with the intensification of military operations conducted by the Pakistani military and the drone strikes. It was Benjamin Hopkins' work, the historian who wrote the book, The Ruling the Savage Periphery, and a very eminent Pakistani social scientist in London, Adeel Malik, whose book Patchwork States has been a great inspiration in British imagination for governing India as a whole. Pakistan itself represents a similar frontier region in the larger global world state system. The primary principle of frontier crime resolution is actually being applied through the rest of Pakistan. I'm very pleased to talk about a recent paper of mine that I wrote with my colleagues Faizal Iman from IBA and Injinali Mirza, assistant professor at Kent. The paper really focuses on frontier areas, and it looks at why frontier regions are more prone to conflict in the face of shocks. We know that globally a lot of frontier regions, border regions that are at the edges of the empires, are more prone to conflict, but we don't understand why that is the case. And we argue that a lot of these differences in conflict could be understood by looking back at how colonizers ruled these frontier territories. Typically, French, British colonial officers and administrations, when they went to these large spaces, they encountered a lot more resistance in frontier regions that were border regions. There is also more grave threat from neighboring regions. There was always limited agricultural potential, so the potential to tax them was also more difficult. So they had more thin presence of the state in these regions. And Sir Orif Carroll, for example, in the context of Northwest Pakistan, talked about how the line of administration stopped like a tide the moment it hits the frontier territory. And we argue that these regions are more prone to conflict, in part because they were governed very differently. They had very limited presence at the state. There was a lot more reliance on local tribal elites for conflict resolution. They were the primary linchpin of the state. Formal institutions of conflict management were absent. And once these regions are hit with a shock and the grievances increase, there are no formal avenues to channelize those grievances. Therefore, you're more likely to see the rise of sovereignty contesting forms of violence, that is violence against the state. So these regions are more likely to see insurgencies. Now, to understand this better, we actually collected highly fine-grained data for Northwest Pakistan, 10 by 10 kilometer grids and level data, where we looked at conflict incidents against the state. And we selected those regions that are super close to each other, because we are aware that there's so many different factors that could determine their different proclivity for conflict. So we use a historical border, 1970 border, that defined and divided the second districts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa from the frontier tribal agencies. And this border was largely built for idiosyncratic reasons. The British knew that this larger limited space has to be governed differently, but the precise placement of the border was being doubted. And then these institutions, these exceptional institutions, actually persisted over time. In 2018, FATA was not integrated into the rest of Pakistan. Even today, it remains largely unintegrated. So we then looked at conflict incidents, and we used the 9/11 shock, which was a shock to grievance against the state, because the war in Afghanistan was hugely unpopular in KP. On the settled districts, there were institutions of conflict management that could channelize those grievances. On the frontier agencies, in those frontier agencies, actually there was largely an institutional void. So that led to an uptick in violence, which then led the state to respond to that violence against the state through military operations, through drone strikes, which actually exacerbated conflict. So we actually show in our paper that the rise of violence really coincides with the intensification of military operations conducted by the Pakistani military and the drone strikes. So this is really a story about institutional void, how conflict thrives in those spaces where normal institutions of conflict management are largely absent. One of the mechanisms through which this takes place is the elimination of tribal elites. Again, we use highly fine-grained data to show that in all those patient units, in all those regions where there was a first ever attack on a tribal leader, those regions witnessed an immediate uptick in violence in the subsequent period. Now, there's a larger pattern here. In Africa, you have Al-Shabaab, you have Al-Qaeda, you have a whole range of these movements in different parts of Africa or the Muslim world. And we find that in a lot of those settings as well, whenever a tribal chief is killed, whenever the key interlocutor between the state and the civil society is eliminated, it immediately creates an institutional vacuum. And that institutional vacuum actually generates a lot of violence. So this actually helps us understand why these border regions are more prone to conflict. And they also help us understand how in settings where you have exceptional institutional role, those spaces are more prone to violence. Now, you have lots of such territories spread across the world. Fata is one setting where exceptional institutional rule was set up. But there is Basra, Vilayat, where the British actually created a very different institutional arrangement compared to the rest of Iraq. You have the south of Yemen compared to the rest of the Yemen. You have northern Nigeria. You have Kenya Special Powers Act. In a lot of these spaces, you have what historian Benjamin Hopkins describes as frontier governmentality, a different mode of governance in frontier regions where you rule through elites, where you share your power over coercion with local elites, and where there's a larger institutional body. We argue that the argument that we are making is relevant not just for understanding insurgency-based violence, it's also understanding for routine violence in a lot of different settings. One of our original inspiration was Benjamin Hopkins' work, the historian who wrote the book, The Ruling the Savage Periphery, and a very eminent Pakistani social scientist in London, Adeel Malik, whose book Patchwork States has been a great inspiration, in which he also argued how the post 9/11 disruption of frontier rule in these tribal areas actually led to a huge increase in violence. In fact, a lot of the insights of this paper are relevant for understanding developments in today's Pakistan, because I believe that the role that the frontier regions played in British imagination for governing India as a whole, Pakistan itself represents a similar frontier region in the larger global world state system. Here you have exceptional institutional arrangement. Here you have ruling through man on the spot. This is exactly the term that British historians as well as British administrators deployed. These are measures where we rule through man on the spot, which is these are political agents, these are tribal leaders, you rule through them rather through institutions. And these regions were typically cut off from the rest of the world in terms of their economic linkages. And they also had less reliance on institutions of conflict management, more exceptional rule. And they also had collective punishment, which is to say, if there is any issue with somebody in a tribe, the entire tribe could be punished for the sins of one person who is just a member of the tribe. Today, you find in Pakistan, for example, the idea of collective punishment, which is the primary principle of frontier crime examination, is actually being applied through the rest of Pakistan. We also find that in the last 2 or 3 years, the institutions of conflict management have been systematically destroyed. The media, courts, judiciary, other institutions, policing arrangements, these have all become highly partial. The state-society relationship is fractured. So what happened in post 9/11, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, particularly in frontier agencies, is now a challenge that the Pakistani state is facing as a whole, because the similar breakdown of institutions of conflict management that then create the problem for state-society relationship. So this is a hugely important aspect for those who think about dealing with violence through military means. The military, as an instrument, can only be deployed quickly and then taken back. The moment you insert the military into an equation without addressing underlying grievances, without making long-term institutional compromises, it doesn't work. It can actually escalate violence. So I think these issues are hugely important, both in the Pakistani context, but also in the context of other developing countries. What I find fascinating about social science is that you study about history, you study about contemporary political economy, you identify patterns in one setting which are transportable or replicable to another place, and it gives you an entirely different way of looking at the context that you are studying. And historical political economy, which is a field where you take history very seriously, but you then link the past with the present, look at the way in which historical structures persist over time, how they interact with geopolitical shocks or domestic political shocks, how does the state respond to that, is a kind of dynamic interplay between economics, politics, in a very historically conscious way, is hugely interesting for me as a social scientist. I'm not a historian, but I love going into archives and reading about these accounts. So some of the most fascinating historical accounts I've read are for those imperial administrators who were actually posted in Northwest Pakistan, and they were looking at the local situation, coming up with particular types of solutions, coining the term frontier governmentality, and then replicating it in Kenya, replicating it in northern Nigeria, replicating it in Basra Vilayat, and how that imperial knowledge then gets translated through the posting of these different colonial officers in other different settings is one of the most fascinating things I find about this discipline. But also, it convinces me that history is not just an isolated study of the past. History is a very alive subject where you can find larger patterns which persist over time or change or interact with other factors to explain our contemporary events. So that's the broader scope of my paper, and I hope you will be able to read that paper. You go to the United Nations University website, just type the words frontier and Middle conflict, and there is also a blog that is associated with that. I've also been invited to write a more detailed blog for Hoover Institution at Stanford, and that blog will come out in this talk. I hope you will enjoy the paper. Feel free to ask us any questions that you might have.